So before we get started, may I just say a very brief word of thanks to all of our partners and sponsors. TT18 takes place with their generous support, and if it weren't for them, we would not be here. Our sponsors are the PTV Group, just mentioned in the last session, Philip von Hagen's company, now the owner of that group. Mobike, which we also heard in that last session, which has grown from a startup to a sharing bike service in 200 different cities. And our partners, CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, FIA Foundation, Germany's GIZ, its Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, and its Industry of the Environment and Construction. Also the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the ITDP, that is the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, as well as SLOCAT, the Partnership on Sustainable Low-Carbon Transport, and finally, of course, the initiative that has been mentioned here numerous times already, the Sustainable Mobility for All initiative. We're very, very grateful to all of our partners and sponsors for making TT18 possible. And allow me just also to remind you that you can tweet. We're at hashtag TTDC18, so if you're hearing things that you think are noteworthy, please send them out there. And of course, you can also follow us online at our website, www.transformingtransportation.org. So just a reminder about how the topic of this next plenary relates to the overarching theme of this year's forum. In its essence, the transport that we want, the transport that is the goal of the Sum for All initiative, is mobility that links up the economic, the environmental, and the social dimensions of sustainability. It connects people to jobs, markets, and services while simultaneously reducing congestion and pollution, and in that way has the potential to generate very real social and economic as well as environmental gains. But that potential will only be realized if the disruptive transport technologies that we mentioned in that last session are harnessed for the benefit of all. And of course, that was a subject that also came up in our first plenary, because otherwise, if we don't really look at access, then those who are left behind may face even greater disparities than in the past in terms of accessing not only jobs and education, but also health and social services. And that is why the Sustainable Mobility for All initiative includes a very important universal access objective. And that's why we're focusing in this session on how the ecosystem of new mobility services can be shaped to fulfill that universal access objective to provide equitable, safe, clean, and accessible transport for all citizens, and especially the least fortunate. So we want to begin with a brief input from two researchers who have been using digital tracking tools to more accurately measure transportation access and its wider effects. And their work clearly reveals that there is an enormous potential social and economic benefit of connecting people and places. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tatiana Peralta Quiros. She is an economist with the World Bank who works with transport teams to develop consistent approaches to transport data that drive evidence-based sustainable mobility planning. And it's also a pleasure to welcome Diego Canales. He is a Tools and Data Innovation Associate at the WRI's Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, where he works on identifying trends related to the future of mobility services and disruptive market services in urban settings. So welcome to both of you, and please, we look forward to your input.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us to speak. It really is our pleasure. My name is Tati. This is Diego. And we're really thrilled to kick off what we think is going to be the most interesting and accessible plenary of all of Transforming Transportation.
Thank you, Tati. So there's this notion about what's more important to measure, whether mobility or access. And throughout time, we have actually been measuring mobility using different indicators like travel time savings under the assumption that improving mobility would actually improve accessibility. But now we actually have a way, we have tools, we have data, we have computation power to actually begin measuring what really matters, which is access. Access to jobs, access to schools, health centers, or leisure. And we think also that access is a very powerful concept because it allows not only to look at the urban transport network in isolation, but actually how it connects with the urban layout and how it's able to connect people from where they are to where they want to go.
So what we're talking about really is, we're not saying that in the future we would like to do this. We're not saying in a couple years we might be able to streamline this. But this is actually really exciting work that is going on right now. See, by developing open source technologies, we're actually able to push data-driven solutions. We're able to understand in terms of quantifiable terms, such as access to jobs, what is the efficiency of the public transportation network? How well does the urban form work? What are the impacts of different transportation projects? You see, this was the first project that we actually measured the change in access to jobs for a project right here at the bank, and this was the metro in Lima. But we've actually now deployed this, and we're able to scale this up globally. This is another project that we actually were able to measure the impact in terms of access to jobs, the BRT in Dar es Salaam, which I'm sure you're going to hear more about later from one of our panelists. And we're actually, as I said, able to globally mainstream this as part of our basic analysis. These are all the places where the WRI and the World Bank has been able to deploy access in order to drive data-driven solutions and understand the impacts of our transportation networks.
So we like access because it gives us a framework to be able to evaluate and measure all transport modes and see how they work in an integrated network. In the past, we had been looking at transport modes in an isolated manner, right? So looking at the impacts of each one of them. But now with access, we're able to look about them in a framework and look at the impacts and how they connect and complement each other, right? And now we're able to do that. For example, I'm looking here at some isochrones, so that's the access level. At the start, we see the first small circle. It's actually, what is the access if I just go walking from a point? But as we add other modes, like for example, walking and public transport, I have more access. And so on with bicycling. And at the end, we can actually begin measuring what's the impact of putting ride-hailing to be first and last mile connector of the public transport. And this was done just for one single point in time, but we can do it for multiple times during the day or different days of the week because the transit service actually varies throughout the time.
And then finally, all this morning, essentially, what we're hearing is, what is the role of disruptive technology? Because what we know is that technology is going to essentially change how we think about transportation networks. So we actually started looking at one of these drivers for potentially disrupting transport, shared mobility. So we started looking at the effects of transport network companies or shared mobility would have in cities. But what we were trying to look at is actually how can we use this tool in order to complement existing transport networks? You see, it's exactly how what Robin Chase was mentioning before in the last panel. It's not actually about technology, but how we can use policy to drive the use of that technology. So something really interesting right now is happening in Sao Paulo, where they have implemented a tax per kilometer for transport network companies. And this serves us at least a step closer to actually getting the road pricing right. Now, what is interesting about this is that this is not a static tax, but it's a dynamic tax that can actually change based on your location and time. So what Sao Paulo has done is actually draw a radius, and actually you can see this radius right here, to call the city center. So trips inside of that city center would actually have a higher tax than trips outside of the city center. But we actually think that access can work as a tool to target this tax a lot better. You see, what we started doing is actually measuring how the access to employment opportunities changes throughout the day by only using the formal network. So as you can see, what we can do right now is actually place a target based on access to opportunities. We can say we want 50% of jobs being accessible, and this is just an example, by formal transit. And this can vary, so the geography of that tax can change throughout the day. And we can now use the transport network company in order to serve, as Diego said, as a first and last mile connectivity to the existing transportation network.
Because at the end of the day, it's not just about moving quicker in a city, right? What we want is actually to provide services for people to get to jobs, for children to go to schools, and parents to go to health centers. And we think that access allows us to look at the transport network in an integrated manner, looking at the impacts. And we think that our role as either transport planners or mobility service providers is begin moving the needle and not only delivering mobility, but actually access as a service. And we think that by measuring access, we're heading in the right way, and we know we're heading the right path. So thank you.
We'll leave it off to the panel to explore further.